climbing has a lot of nuance in it. And for these competitions, they're trying to make the climbs in a way that's very engaging for the audience. They try to do these kind of parkour style of movements, which isn't very close to what you might encounter when you're on real rock. And that's quite a big debacle in the climbing industry, because it creates this separation between competition climbing and rock climbing. There was actually a pretty massive thing about this in the Olympics in 2020. When climbing was introduced into the Olympics, they combined 3 different disciplines: speed climbing, lead climbing, and bouldering. And it's kind of like mixing a marathon with a 100-meter track.
Like, oh, that looks like our sport, but that's not really our sport?
A lot of climbers would say yes to that question. It is very different from climbing. I wouldn't say it connects so well to what I do and what most climbers do. In bouldering, for instance, the way that the sport is evolving is...
The sport of rock climbing is undergoing a renaissance. Just this year, it returned to the global stage at the Olympics. Meanwhile, films like Solo and The Alpinist have captivated audiences worldwide. These stories have not only redefined what's possible on the rock, but introduces a whole new generation to the pursuit of the impossible. But behind this rise, there's a story that goes much deeper. 50 years ago, climbing was the domain of outcasts and rebels born out of the counterculture movement of the 1970s. Back then, men who called themselves dirtbags would piece together makeshift gear from a surplus store and face unimaginable risks, all for the thrill of the climb. But today, the sport has really transformed. Rock climbing is no longer just an act of defiance. It's a lifestyle defined by indoor bouldering gyms, glossy brands, and even high-tech gear designed to keep us safe. But in this blend of past and present, we find climbers like Emil Abrahamsson, a man who embodies both the rebellious spirit of the dirtbag and the polished world of modern climbing. Emil's journey is extraordinary. An engineer turned full-time climber and YouTuber, one that mirrors the evolution of the sport itself. I brought him here today to talk not only about climbing, but to explore what it means to step into the unknown. What drives someone to walk away from the familiar and take the risks that so many of us are afraid to face. We all have that part of us that longs for more, that wonders what would be if we only dared. A new career, a breakthrough in a relationship, or pushing our bodies to new heights. But so often, we hesitate. We stand at the base of the mountain, looking up, never daring to make the climb. This episode is about what it takes to begin that ascent, to take the first step when your fear tries to hold you back. So ask yourself, what's stopping you from making the climb? Welcome to the Gabby Reece Show. Let's go. So Emil, welcome to the show. I always love to do them in person, but we really wanted to visit with you, and I also know it's late at night there. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here. It's gonna be a good time.
Are you in Sweden right now?
Mm-hmm. Stockholm. That's where I'm born and raised.
Yes. So let's get a little bit into. So a lot of times I'm going to have you, what's going to be sort of really rudimentary questions for you about rock climbing, because I think sometimes unless you're a rock climber, people don't understand how many kind of nuanced elements there is to rock climbing. So, whether it's routes, sort of longer climbs, or bouldering, indoor, outdoor, there's so many actually interesting variables about rock climbing. So bear with us when I ask you some of those questions, because they'll feed into understanding more about what you do.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm psyched for it. Hit me.
So how did you get into rock climbing, first off?
Okay. Well, I started out as a heavy gamer kid. So I would just sit in front of the computer basically every single day, just gaming away. And then my brother actually started when he was 18 and I was 15 at the time. He brought me to the climbing gym, and I absolutely hated it for the first couple of times. And I stopped quickly. And then a couple of months later, I decided to tag along one more time, and that's when I got hooked. And the thing is, I connect a lot of my passion for climbing to that old gaming passion, because a lot of it is about problem solving and trying to it's almost like a big video game where your body is just kind of this character that evolves. and after a while you become better and better at it, and you evolve with the game of climbing, I guess.
So is it safe to say sort of maybe, I don't know, in the late like 2010-ish, we started seeing indoor gyms kind of really popping up. When people go to these gyms, they'll actually also change, all of the handles and foot placements and all these things where, so it is really, like you said, it's a creative and problem solving situation. I think people don't understand
Hmm.
how big of a part of the sport that is.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a whole thing actually, because well, climbing has these different disciplines, and I'm sure a lot of people have seen it now in the Olympics and have started understanding that it's quite a, a broad sport, so to speak. But the two main disciplines that people do as a sport are called lead climbing and bouldering. Lead climbing, that's longer climbing, you expect, especially since you use a rope for it, and it's about 30 feet to 60 feet of climbing on average. So you get quite fatigued. It's aerobic capacity, and it's quite tiring. Bouldering, on the other hand, is only about 15 feet high at the highest. So it's still a few. It's a bit to climb, but you're going to hit that anaerobic system instead, and that's where the problem solving comes in a lot more, because the routes are shorter, so there's not as much climbing to be done. And so when the climbs are prepared, they're intentionally set, so to speak, with the idea to provoke some sort of thought in you of like, oh, how do I solve my way up this climb? So those are the two primary ways to separate them. Lead climbing is more just training, very much training. You get tired as all all living hell out of it. But with bouldering, it is more about the problem solving aspect.
In doing a little bit of homework for this conversation, I realized that training for what you do is actually, it's almost tricky. It's like, in what way do you train to support a certain type of climbing? And if you're competing, you know, it's like you're getting weaker in a different type of climbing.
Hmm.
I think there's so much nuance. So let's talk about that type of training. You decided a little to stop competing in the World Cup circuit, and I heard you say that in certain ways because you were so specific to that you were actually getting weaker in kind of other parts of climbing.
Hmm.
So I guess people don't realize because they see it as so physical, but it's also the art of what you do.
I see.
It's a balance, right?
It is a balance, and precisely like you say, climbing has a lot of nuance in it. And for these competitions, they're trying to make the climbs in a way that's very engaging for the audience. And what happens then is that they try to do these kind of parkour style of movements. So a lot of swinging from just your arms and jumping between different holds and stuff like that, which isn't very close to what you might encounter when you're on real rock. And that's quite a big debacle in the climbing industry, because you need that showy part for the sport to grow. It is an important aspect to it. If you just saw some people pulling hard on small holds, the audience wouldn't understand what was going on. But these massive jumps and stuff, they're pretty cool to watch. But it creates this sort of separation between competition climbing and rock climbing. And my background in climbing is it's quite rooted in that rock climbing area. So that's why I decided to stop doing competitions a little bit more and focus more on, well, rock climbing.
This podcast is brought to you by Maui Nui Venison. I don't know about you, but we are always trying to find high quality proteins, and this is it. First of all, very responsible. It is the only stress-free wild harvested meat on the market. So starting from that point of view, I love sharing it with my friends and certainly giving it to my family. It actually was given to us as a gift many, many years ago. I got my first box, shows up at my house, so easy to use. And then the nutritional component. It is some of the most nutrient dense meat that you're going to find on the market. In some cases, they've done some studies up to 53% more protein than grass-fed beef. So I know that that's always a conversation, is trying to get enough protein so that we can recover and keep our muscle healthy and all these things. And that's hard to do. And of course, finally, it's delicious. It's so easy to use. It's not like someone's going to be like, hey, this is hard to cook, or I don't know how to use it, or it's gamey. It's so easy. We throw it on a barbecue. I mix it. You can do a bolognese. All the ways that you cook regular protein you can use. They even have great snacks. They have a jerky, but their bone broth is off the hook. Talk about an easy way to get protein. If you've been curious or you're in search of, they have a great offer for you today. So all you have to do is go to MauiNuiVenison.com. And when you order, you just put in the code Gabby, Gabby, and you'll get 20% off your order. So that's MauiNuiVenison.com. And don't forget to use the code Gabby, Gabby. And remember, it shows up right at your house. And that's MauiNuiVenison.com, MauiNuiVenison.com. And don't forget to use the code Gabby at checkout. Yeah. And I always love, for example, let's say you watch a sport where somebody makes it look almost really difficult and the audience goes, oh, that's, incredible. But what they don't realize is the people who make it look easy, they're doing something very, very difficult. And, it's an interesting thing where we live in a time where you have like, how do you grow your sport? How do you make a living? They've got a circuit and it almost departs away from the things that make the sport for the athlete and make the sport for the viewer. And so it's always that dance and seeing how you've actually done it though now in storytelling. So you get to really do the way you want to do it, even though I know you spend a long time having to film it and edit and do all these things. People don't maybe realize how long that takes, that opportunity just in a different platform. How did you make the decision to go, you know what, I'm going to not compete and I'm going to trust the storytelling part and then pursue my passion of my sport?
That's a very interesting question. I don't think I've ever received it, actually. So I haven't reflected on it all that much, to be honest. I think for me, I've always loved talking about climbing with people. So it's honestly a passion of mine to just sit and chat, try and explain it, or talk to experienced climbers. Either way it goes, I'm happy. And that has been a root of my passion as well, just discussing climbing and discussing within the climbing world. Well, we talk a lot about movements and how to solve these problems. And that is where my psyche comes from, so to speak. And I would say that with YouTube and video making and presenting climbing in that way, I'm definitely a lot more connected to that aspect of the sport, to the actual communication of what is climbing, how does it work, and it challenges me in a way that hits home more than competitions generally do, is how I describe it.
Mm-hmm. What is it in you, though, that you have the strength to trust yourself? Because I think it's very hard when you do an alternative sport, a lifestyle sport. It's already hard enough to make a living. And to have the ability to say, okay, you know what, I'm actually going to do the thing that I think reflects who I am and the way I want to do this. Is it, where does that come from? Because a lot of times we do what we think we have to do.
Yeah, you're right, for sure. It was a tricky process. Luckily in the climbing world, we have this, dirtbag term where you live in a van and you just roam around, and it's quite cheap to live that way. So a lot of when I started out with YouTube and focusing fully on that part of climbing, I lived in a van and I traveled around and just had very, very, very low expenses every month. And it created this, this world where I could do it full time and focus on just that. And it still, stayed quite connected to what I like to do, because I enjoyed living in the van. I enjoyed living cheap. So that's kind of how I began to trust it and think like, this is going to be fun. This is going to be a good way to live my life.
I think it's, what about your parents? Were they like, hey, how long is this going to go on? Like, what about the outside? I don't want to say reasonable world, but
yeah,
because I think a lot of people want to try, and it doesn't mean in climbing, just in their life, to pursue something that is unknown and you don't really know the outcome. It's a little bit against tradition, but the reward that people experience when they do that, I think you only know that once you've done that.
Yeah, yeah, it's a well. The funny answer is that I come from a family of quite creative people who like to play music and do all of these things. And both me and my brother, we ended up becoming engineers essentially. Where he's a fully fledged engineer, and I started my engineering degree. And I think my parents actually thought it was kind of boring. So they were very excited when I went down the climber route, so to speak, and doing that full time, because it was a change of how we'd been in the past. So it was definitely never a problem for them that I was going down this route. So yeah,
I love that. I used to joke, I have 3 daughters, and I'm like, if any of them came to me and said they were going to be an accountant, that would be like a huge failure, or
yeah,
like an attorney. You'd be like, no. The climbing itself, I think people don't realize because they see, especially if they're videos, and obviously you share some of the failures, but you get the impression that the majority of the sport is really about failure. Now, obviously on the long routes, like, okay, people see free solo, they see these big climbs. That's obviously not about failure, right? That's about taking your time, conditions, practice, methodical. I think people don't realize how methodical that preparation is. But in what you're doing, you're probably fail, 90% of the time. I'm making it up, but let's say that high. Most of us can endure that psychologically, where we accept that the success is really in the small 10%. So for you as a person that this is what you do, where do you have what's the medal? Like inside, what do you tell yourself when it's, oh, this is part of the process? Or, like, what is that?
I think if you want to become very good at climbing, you sort of have to embrace the idea of getting shut down and failing. Like you say, it is one of the biggest parts of the sport. You will fail 98% of the time, probably. You have a very, very, very small window of actual success when you're performing the sport. So if you don't actually embrace that, if you don't embrace, going head first and taking a beating, then you're not going to have a good time. So I would for sure say it becomes kind of an essential part of it the more you do it.
Is that a personality type, or is that just a relationship with climbing?
I think it's a bit of both. I think climbing attracts that personality type a lot, but it definitely is as well. You can access the sport regardless of how you are, I think. But to progress, I think in general it will be a very common trait among high performing climbers for sure.
It feels like original climbing, let's say, or when it started to become a little more mainstream, and I just mean people climbing, weirdly, like in the 90s, before you were born. I interviewed Lynn Hill. Do you know who that is?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so I interviewed Lynn Hill, and she had done El Cap by then herself. She was the first person, not male or female, right? But you sort of got this, even though because it's so difficult what you guys are doing, you got sort of the camaraderie element of climbing. And now it feels like in the last kind of 20 years or so, there's this new dynamic of competitive, like sure. A different, because you have the wall and maybe the stakes are a little lower. It's just different, right? I'm just curious for you, as somebody who seems also like the art of it, the challenge of it, how do you, when that shows up, like when you're competing, is it always against the wall or the rock or the boulder? Or is it all of a sudden like, oh, you know what? I don't like him. I really don't want to lose to him today. Like this, what part of that do you navigate? Because usually when people get into the sport, it is this, I'm going to challenge myself. I'm going to be creative. I'm going to solve problems. I'm going to do something really hard. And now all of a sudden you've got this new part of it. I'm curious for you if it was like, yeah, maybe I'm going to make videos. I don't know.
It's an interesting question. I would say that for me, I struggle a lot with, actually, when it comes back to failing at competitions is something I do struggle with. It's not fun at all.
Losing? You mean losing?
Well, not actually. Not actually not losing. Doing it. I mean, partly losing at times, quite regularly.
Yeah, no, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
But it is you're onto something though with how I think it does differ from a lot of different sports, because when you're competing in climbing, you get no input from what anybody else is really doing. All you know is that you're either doing okay or terribly, usually. Because if you don't get to the top, it means you failed at something that others probably succeeded at. Because the way that the climbs are created, they're created that way for people to make it to the top, to progress in the competitions. So it's very frustrating at times, the competitions, because you're just trying to figure out this problem and you only have a few minutes to do it, because that's how the competitions work. You only have between 4 and 5 minutes to solve it. And every second that passes and every attempt that you make at climbing the route, you better make it the best you can. And if you don't do that, well, you're out.
I always think when I see how when you turn and then look up and it's like, okay, you're seeing things for the first time. It's sort of like a movie where someone sees the line, it's like a light and they see the line perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
Are there things in your preparation, whether it's your sleep or, a fight with your girlfriend, whatever that is, that you go, hey, when this is off in my life, I don't see the line as quickly. Do you notice that? Or is it just like I'm having a good day, a bad day? Like, I'm wondering if you've gotten to a place that you can create an environment to allow that to come through you easier.
So when I rock climb, I can definitely connect with that a lot more. So because when you are rock climbing, you get to prepare so much more for the actual climb, because you know what you're going to be facing. And then I have a lot of routines in terms of sleeping and skin preparation and all of these things that you do to prepare for it.
No, wait. No. You don't get to just blow by that.
Okay.
So what do you mean skin preparation?
Oh, okay. Well, so this is where the nerdiness of rock climbing comes in. That
Great.
there are a lot of different rock types out there. So you've got sandstone, granite, limestone, etc. And all of these will interact with your skin a little bit differently from the other. And I know that sounds pretty bizarre, but basically the way that your hand will grip against the rock will be different depending on the rock type. And so if I'm going on sandstone, for instance, I'll want to have very, very dry skin. And then I have to figure out, how do I get dry enough skin for it? So that's what I mean about skin preparation.
How do you do it? Is it like rubbing alcohol? How do you get it dry?
So that's one method that you use temporarily, but you can also do a lot of things before. So some people use different lotions. I personally use something called antihydral, which is this weird cream that you use if you have like hyperhidrosis, where you have excessive sweating for your feet.
Yeah.
So I use a little bit of that, very, very little, on my hands, and that gets them very, very dry. This is the second nerdy thing about rock climbing, is that every climber has a unique skin type, so they have to find out for themselves what the best method is. So that's a big part of the preparation. But for competitions, it's you don't really know what you're going to be facing. So for me, it's a lot harder to prepare, for instance, my skin for a competition.
That's so fascinating. And what about the conditioning part? I would imagine that, like you said, strength and problem solving for things, bouldering, and even I would imagine the indoor rock climbing, and this endurance for the longer routes. What are the things, let's say right now, because now you're doing sort of the things that you want to be doing. How does one, besides doing the activity itself, actually train for the sport?
Yeah, there are a lot of things to be done. I think in most sports, to be honest, but in climbing, you have to find your own pool of tools to use. But the most common thing that most strong climbers will be using is something called a hangboard. And that's essentially just a wooden edge of some sort at around 20 millimeters size. So like an inch or so, that we hang from. And we add weight to hang from it. So this is like the hypertrophy and very strength-focused way of training for rock climbing. And there are countless methods to do this, but I would say the most common one is something called max hangs, which is when you add as much weight as you can and just hang. Gets you
Do
strong,
you,
but it's
do
painful.
you know how miserable, like for me, this is like how swimming is.
Hmm.
It's like, it's so quiet. People don't understand what's going on. And it is so brutal. Like it's brutal.
Hmm.
Do you listen to, like when you're training, do you listen to music? Like how do you get into that space? Is it because you go, hey, this is going to support me so much in my sport that it's worth it? Or like for you, is it also something you have to get through?
I dig into it a lot. I really love training so much. Kind of whatever form it is, as long as I'm trying hard, I'm having a good time. Um, you look skeptical, but
Well, it's
but
just a very different personality type. I mean, listen, I understand. I've had some misery, physical misery in my life. I understand. I live with somebody who seems to enjoy it as well.
yeah,
But you guys take it to something, it's so quiet. It's like this stillness. Like if you're doing other sports, you can be in like a storm and get into the pain. You guys have to actually somehow be in this stillness.
yeah. No, it's
Where
it.
do you dig the well deeper? Like that's what I mean. Like how do you do that? Do you have a meditation practice? I mean, obviously you have a visualization, probably components, but, and does that system ever get fatigued?
Oh, I love these questions. It's really fun to dig into this. Yeah, the system does get fatigued. It is. I would say that specifically this type of finger training on a hangboard can be quite inconsistent if you don't have like very rigorous methods for it. Um, and by that I mean like for instance, I do need my music. It helps a lot, and it'll
It
usually be pretty. Usually, it will be quite heavy music of some sort that just gets me kind of going a bit
psycho?
crazy. Yeah, a bit psycho. Yeah,
Yeah,
you're right.
right.
You're
Right.
spot on, and that does help tremendously. I will say it does. But I think in general you have to. It's the fundamental part is just embracing that misery, embracing that it is kind of painful and it's not going to feel fantastic, and get into that zone for sure.
Yeah, because I mean, the notion of what your hands and your grip, your forearms, what you guys do, um, people, we don't understand. Now, are there, like all sports, right? You have genetic components. So you
Mm.
guys have, you're probably, your ligament and tendon strength is probably off the charts or more naturally stronger than most people. There's probably a strength to weight ratio that's impressive. And then you need flexibility
Hmm.
and power. So are there times where you're like, hey, I have to lay off this certain food? Like, are there times that you're consciously calibrating, the sweet spot for all of this?
Definitely. There was actually a pretty massive thing about this in the Olympics in 2020, because when climbing was introduced into the Olympics, they combined three different disciplines: speed climbing, lead climbing, and bouldering. And it's kind of like mixing a marathon with a 100-meter track and just saying like, oh, the person who does on average the best in these, that's the winner. Because especially speed climbing is insanely explosive. I don't know if you saw that in the recent Olympics, but it is, even for us climbers, devoted climbers, it is bizarre to watch. Um, and
When
because
you
of that,
say that,
sorry.
when you say that, does it feel like, oh, that looks like our sport, but that's not really our sport? Like that's a different sport?
A lot of climbers would say yes to that question. I personally really enjoy watching it. I think it is the ability to grind something down so hard that you can get up a 15-meter wall in under 5 seconds is just completely bizarre, and I do enjoy watching it. I It is very different from climbing, the way I view climbing at least, and I wouldn't say it connects so well to what I do and what most climbers do. But I do think it's the way forward for climbing as a competitive sport, because as we already kind of discussed in bouldering, for instance, the way that the sport is evolving is quite far from regular rock climbing. So there will be ultimately within competition climbing some sort of strange mashup of climbing
Yeah.
features presented in a sport.
Yeah, it's some guys from the IOC going, "Hey, I know, I've got an idea. We can do this." And it has, not that it doesn't have anything to do with the sport, but it's just very different. Do
Hmm.
those speed climbers, do they already know the route before?
Yeah, so it's a
So it's
standard.
just really a straight physical sprint,
Mhm.
and that's that.
Precisely. It is a standardized route. It's technically quite a difficult route, but it is a standardized one that's been the same since 2007, I want to say.
Oh, come on.
Yeah,
That's what they do?
yeah.
So it's really strong, powerful,
Hmm.
not creative people.
I don't want to
I'm
give
just
them.
kidding. I'm joking. I'm joking. But I mean, the same route, that's what they're doing.
They are day in, day out, and just, becoming better
Oh,
and better at it.
I'd love to be around a campfire with a bunch of like, quote, real climbers in here with the dialogue is about that. But
There isn't a lot of love towards speed climbers. I will be honest. It
yeah, of
is,
course.
they do struggle a lot.
Do you have any crossovers? Do you have guys that are speed climbers that somehow are actually able to do the other?
There have been some in the past. In the last Olympics, I would for sure say yes, because the speed climbing discipline wasn't particularly refined at that time. I think
Mhm.
the top guys got like 5.5 seconds at the last Olympics, and now they've cut out half a second off of that. And I mean,
Wow.
if we imagine that in a 100-meter track, that would be
Yeah.
pretty bizarre to cut out, half a second in
Yeah.
3 years' time. Um, so there's definitely a big evolution that's happened within that discipline. And so
Yeah.
nowadays, I don't think there are any very good people at, combining the two at the top level.
Right. Because
Yeah.
it's getting too specialized.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's go back to your sort of, body composition negotiation for which environment.
Mm.
Do you have a brunt of your season? I mean, you could travel the world and probably climb, anywhere, anytime. But what does a season or your year generally look like?
So I can kind of give the general idea of a competition climber, because, well, the way it works is that we have the World Cups starting in around April and finishing in around September,
Hmm.
October. So it's quite a long season, around 6 months of competitions, not necessarily back to back, but maybe two a month or so on average, which becomes quite hectic, especially since they're situated literally everywhere in the world. And China, um, Germany, well, not Germany, France, different places
Yeah.
around the world. So you do have to do a lot of traveling if you're trying to do all of the World Cups, and it does tire you out. So then those 6 months are dedicated towards just competitions, and then most people will do an off season starting in around November until February or so. And around February, we start doing these kind of minor competitions around more locally, you could say. So there's usually a startup series in Germany, for instance, here in Europe, of just some small competitions that people will go to sort of get into the mindset of, okay, it's time to go again. So it's about, yeah.
Is there, so how long typically, let's say someone's doing well, I don't, in a competition, in one particular competition, how long of a period of time is that competition?
Well, one competition is just, if we take a regular bouldering World Cup, that will be one qualification round where you're climbing for a total of 25 minutes, one semifinal where you're climbing for a total of 16 minutes, 20 minutes, depends on, and then a final where you're climbing for, well, roughly 16 minutes as well. So the competitions are very short. There's 3 rounds, and they're usually spaced very closely together. So sometimes, we'll have a qualification on Friday and then semis and finals on Saturday. Um, so yeah, that's generally how it works.
And when the season is over, is there kind of a rebuilding of strength period before a lightning phase? Like, do you guys go through that sort of cycling, or is it always really about staying light and strong?
Yes and no. Some people will do that, and a lot of people will want to go outdoors during the off season. And then it's I would say it's generally quite unstructured, because you're just going out climbing and trying to,
Mhm.
you're probably not training, you're probably not doing your lifting or anything like that, but you're just trying to, you know enjoy that route of it, because a lot of competition climbers will want to go rock climbing as well. But it
Yeah.
does depend a little bit on the personality and what climbing means to you as well.
Yeah, it seems almost like maybe the tour is a place for people where they can make a living at something they love, but then they need to go out on their own to go connect with nature and be outside and have sort of that part of the relationship.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So now that you are on your own and you've kind of taken it into your own hands, so the freedom part must be amazing. How do you choose your challenges that you're going to take on and tell stories about?
So, well, to go into this, the YouTube platform is a very strange platform to do climbing on, I would say, because it's quite hard to navigate what people will want to watch and what they won't want to watch. And generally speaking, the outdoor content is the type of content that does the worst. People don't really want to see rock climbing so much. They want to see indoor climbing sessions or climbing with a complete beginner or stuff like that, and almost always indoors, which creates this sort of strange paradigm for me because as mentioned, I'm a passionate rock climber, but I also want to make the YouTube videos and share my passion for climbing to people who want to watch it. And because of that, I've had kind of my channel has very much gone in waves over the years. It started out as a purely focused on rock climbing type of channel, and nowadays I do all kinds of crazy, silly things regarding climbing. For instance, I held a competition recently for complete beginners, people who have never climbed before, and just found random people in the city of Cologne and said, "Hey, you want to try a rock climbing competition?" And put in a prize, a prize money for it and everything. And it was just really, really fun event that I shot a video of. And that kind of stuff is quite disconnected from rock climbing for me. I mean, actual rock climbing, going outdoors. But it's also was one of the most fun videos I've made in a long time.
So it was and that was indoor?
Yes, that was indoors in a climbing gym that was just opening up down there.
Isn't it funny? We have a joke in our house that the core is poor, and because it's like, well, that's not how you do it, and it's all the rules that everybody puts around. Like skateboarding's infamous for it, surfing's infamous for it. Like that's not surfing, that's not whatever. And so is as long as you have if this is a question, if you feel like you have enough real climbing for yourself, does that make kind of introducing or getting people excited or turned on about climbing okay for you?
So I try to keep what I do on YouTube quite, I want to say, professional. I'm trying to do something that performs well there, and I try to keep my personal climbing more focused on being personal and being what I want it to be. So a lot of the rock climbing that I do, I mostly document, and I usually make videos, but for myself, and then I might not post them because I still want to make them. I still think it's really fun to have that material and have those memories recorded. But it's not always that I end up posting them on YouTube because I know that it'll make the channel perform worse, and I want it to do well.
Yeah. It is. It's just an interesting thing when you have a passion for something and an artistry, and then but the world is not going to understand. And so it's it's always interesting to see people who are in this middle spot, and they go, okay, I'll dance this way. Have you? What happens when you're on a climb, maybe one that's longer and with more risk? When you have, I would imagine, feelings of, I feel stuck. I don't know where I need to go. I can't get where I need to be. How do you keep yourself calm in that moment?
So a lot of it is about, how to put this. It is a tricky question as well, because it depends a lot on where I am mentally, like how tired I am and fatigued I am for the day. Because quite often I'll need to just take a breather, take a step back, and just relax. And then sometimes I just need to try really, really hard. And finding that where to be in that mental space is quite challenging. And I don't know if I have a definitive answer for what I should do and what I would recommend, because it does differ a little bit too often.
Do you wait to know what the answer is and then make the move? Like when you're in the situation, is it like, oh, actually, no, I need to kind of go for it? Is there sort of a moment where you have to just take the pause to wait to see what is the right move?
Yeah, I mean, if we take bouldering for instance,
Hmm.
where I'm trying to solve all the different moves, you're usually standing on the ground for quite some time trying to figure it all out, uh, which which is just a mental, hurdle to work through and figure out. And then it can become quite relaxing. You bring a cup of coffee and you just look at the climb and try to reflect on, what am I supposed to do here? How do I figure this out for my body? Sometimes the answer is just, you're too weak. You got to go home and train. And sometimes the answer is in some very, very minor details that I think all sports have to some degree. These minor details that make you perform better in it and worse. I mean, you've played volleyball professionally. I'm sure
Hmm.
there's a lot of, just in how you position your hands to actually, you know, throw the ball back, has to be very, very, very detailed, right?
But it's different because you're also using reaction, right? So you're in dealing in moment. You guys are in a fixed. I think it's different when you're working from a fixed place where we're getting to use reaction. That's like what's interesting and different, let's say, about golf.
Hmm.
The ball's just sitting there.
Hmm.
So there's something to be said for the beauty, I think, of the subconscious that comes in motion, that's when the training takes over, where what you're dealing with is it's the stillness, which makes it, I think, harder in a very unique way.
Interesting observation. Yeah, for sure. I mean, or I don't know if harder is how I describe it, but it does make it different for sure. Um,
Well, it's becomes a lot more of the mental.
yeah.
And so how have you seen, is it, we call it touching the curtain. There's certain types of training where it's like, hey, you just have to touch the curtain enough times to know I'm okay. Like I'm uncomfortable. I've been here. It kind of sucks. But sometimes when you're in these new environments, so when you started climbing versus now, is it also because you've done it so much that when you get in that place, you're like, one, I'm going to figure it out or I'm not. And that's okay. And when you're in the moment of, do I have to create more energy and more force, or do I
Hmm.
actually need to take a really deep, calm breath? That comes from the repetition, right? From
Hmm.
being in it. I'm just curious how that has even shown up for you in your day-to-day life. What about rock climbing? Because you really have to know yourself in a really unique way that a lot of us don't know ourselves. I'm wondering how that has shown up for you in your day-to-day life, that it impacts you as a person.
So, kind of how climbing has affected me in general as a person.
Yes, and even how you respond
Mm.
to sort of relationships and, someone cutting you off in traffic and, all of these things that we contend with. Are
Mm.
you able to create that much distance in your day to day, kind of real Emil life? Um, has it translated back over to your everyday life?
I would say so. It's. I mean, I have been climbing since I was 15, so I have basically my entire adult life has been surrounded by climbing in one way or another. But over the years, I definitely deal with frustration in a very different way nowadays than from when I started, and that comes uh, almost solely from climbing, I would say. Just the way that if I have a problem, I will approach it in a very different way than I probably would have if I had never climbed. I mean, obviously, growing up is a part of it as well. You get older, you mature, but I do still think that I've learned a lot as a person from the sport. Um, but it always sounds kind of silly to say because it is quite. it's quite abstract to try and explain what that is, what it is that has made the change and has made
Mhm.
me like solve problems differently or view problems differently. But I do feel it, and that is something that resonates with me.
Yeah, and I think in a way, besides the opportunity to get outside and to put yourself in these unique situations, I actually think that's what sport is ultimately supposed to be, right? It's supposed to make the organism, the being, perform better in
Mm.
all ways, not just, okay, I'm fast or I, can climb a rock quickly. I think
Yeah.
people, lose that point.
So
Indoor versus outdoor, like your spirit, the nature component of being outside on real rock. You even talk about the different textures, the nuance, the sky, the clouds, all of this stuff. Um, do you feel different at the end of a day, outdoor climbing versus indoor climbing?
night and day for sure. It's a very, very big difference. Um, Being out in nature can make an absolutely terrible week become amazing out of with just a few hours of being outdoors. Being in a gym surrounded by chalk and techno music might not have the same calming effect. Not to say that it's not good either, but it isn't quite the same. So I would for sure want to give a lot of love to going out and being in nature and what that gives to me, because it is, yeah, it changes my days completely. Make them go from sometimes not so good to completely epic in just a few hours.
If someone is, let's say they do have, access to, and most people, it's probably going to be an indoor gym besides, you know, the hanging boards and things like that. What are the other tools that you're using? Because I mean, do you stretch? Do you lift any weights? Like, how are the other ways that you're supporting your performance?
Okay, yeah, there. I mean, as I just touched on it, there are so many ways to supplement climbing,
Hmm.
and I've done just about every single one of them over the years. I started swimming for a while to add some extra to it. I ran for a while, biked a lot, and most things will help a little bit with it, but the biggest component to becoming a better climber is to climb. And generally speaking, if you do a full climbing workout, if you basically just stay at the gym for a few hours, you get pretty wrecked. So it's more about figuring out how to not be so tired from climbing. The biggest component to becoming better is to train smarter, not more, with climbing, um, because it's just so exhausting. If you go really really hard on a bouldering session, for instance, it's essentially like punching out 100 sets of bench press in a way, because you're just doing the same exercise over and over again, and it is, if you're pushing the physicality of it during a session too much, you end up sort of losing your gains instead of benefiting from it. So a lot of it is about figuring out these things that do supplement to it, and I would say one of the bigger ones would be mobility work. So a lot of us climbers will do that. Some people will do static stretching. Some people will do ballistic, and just all types of different forms of stretching are involved for a lot of climbers. And the ones who don't usually don't perform quite as well. It is a very highly contributing factor to climbing performance.
Now, I know you started young at 15, but do you think you're naturally kind of a flexible, because certain people have more natural flexibility, and where, besides your hips and other things,
Mm.
where is the flexibility? Because it's so interesting to me, the hanging part, the shoulder, all of that. It's so interesting. But would you say naturally you kind of have some flexibility?
I wouldn't actually say that I do. No, most of my flexibility comes from climbing and from training
Mm.
it, and even so, I wouldn't say I'm very flexible given the amount of time I've put into it. But the funny thing about climbing is that you don't really, like you mentioned earlier, a lot of sports have the genetic component as a big factor, and in climbing, there is of course that as well. But you'll find any shapes and sizes performing well within climbing. There aren't really any restrictions as to how you're supposed to look and be. Of course, being lighter generally helps a little bit, but you have people going from 100 pounds to 220 pounds performing at the highest level. So I mean, you're probably gonna be pinned to find somebody at 250 and above who performs at the highest level of climbing, but it isn't extremely rare to find people in the heavier categories as well. Yeah. For instance, even though it is a weight-based sport in many ways, because we can train, we can get stronger, and our muscles will support us. So it's usually that option.
Do you do something though for, we call it unwinding the wind, sometimes even though your sport, you don't have as much repetitive. It's not like, okay, a footballer or a baseball pitcher where it's so repetitive, one-sided, but you guys have obviously some repetitive motions. Do you do anything off the climbing that kind of supports avoiding, issues, injuries, things like that?
I would say most of us do. You usually have to figure out what it is for your body because, as mentioned, it is such a different sport. You have all the shapes and sizes. And because of that, you also need very much to figure out for yourself where your issues might lie. I know some people get very, very tight chests and sort of lose their blood flow to their fingers. And so stretching or opening up the pectoral muscles become, the most important part of all for them, because if they don't, they just cannot climb. Me myself, I have a very, very stiff back that I'm working on constantly. So there are a lot of things to be done with a climber's body to make it function more. But it usually comes down to time and what you want to invest in the most. Shoulders are always stretched out and they need a lot of work. Mostly with that, it comes to strengthening them. So doing some sort of gym workout for that. That's what I do anyways, and what I think most people do. But yeah, definitely a lot of things to be done.
I saw your grip strength. I think, you probably are like, holy cow, people. It's like one of your highest performing videos. And it's like, it's not really, it's obviously an extension of your sport, but it wasn't your sport. So you go in and you do this grip strength competition with, a lot of giant or heavy weighting guys.
For sure.
And were you nervous?
You can't avoid being nervous around those people. I felt like, because it's quite funny, within the climbing world, I am quite a large person. I'm a lot taller than your average World Cup climber. I'm quite a bit heavier than a lot of other climbers. So I'm kind of used to being this big dude in the elite sphere. And then I enter the grip strength competition and it's these giant people. I was literally the smallest person around and I'm supposed to compete with them. So naturally I'm a little bit hesitant and confused and nervous. But it's a different kind of nervous for me because I wasn't expecting anything. I mean, I had no idea how that thing would go. I just knew that we do a lot of grip stuff, and I knew that my grip is kind of strong, so maybe I could have a good time with them. And it ended up being probably the most fun competition I have done in my entire life. Even though I've competed so many times in climbing, it was just, they were so friendly and so happy and so jolly. All of these, giant people, 400-pound men and women running around. And it was a very memorable experience, to say the least.
Yeah, I thought it was incredible. And I actually think it's an incredible competition because it's so difficult. And really one of the best, you're so far ahead as far as one of the best indications for longevity is part of what you guys do. Hanging and grip strength is like, you're halfway to, kind of great independent living forever. So people don't realize how important grip strength is, which brings me to, I know you do it through repetition of rock climbing itself, but for example, what I can lift with my legs is so considerably different, especially as a female with my grip strength. And it's always the interesting, it's a real chink in the link. It's like the part of the link where it really breaks down. Besides hanging, do you have other things that you see people doing or that you like to help? Because that would just help for people in training in general, improve their grip strength.
I think actually a lot of people would benefit from, if they do gym workouts, of using some sort of grip implement for their gym workout. So there are these fat bars, for instance, like thicker bars. I think just using them for your deadlifts, you're gonna get stronger from it for sure. You're gonna get a better grip, and I do think that's quite valuable. I haven't seen it be tested a lot. I don't have the data to back it up, but for sure I would expect it to be quite beneficial for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Um, I actually, it's quite funny. I started training with some of these strongmen from the grip strength competition just to see what they do for grip strength training. And it is very different from us climbers. They have a lot of different implements that they do lift with, but that is exactly what they do. They do strength exercises with the different grips. And I think it's a winning concept if you don't want to spend time climbing and getting all chalky and getting weird shoes on your feet, then for sure using those grip implements could be a good solution.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's also for those of us who don't have the skill to be able to pull themselves up on a rock. It's like, okay, give me a machine or a device to help me. I mean, really, because the
Mhm.
hardest thing to move is your own body, no matter what. And I think it's just an important thing for people to add into their training, for sure. What about food? What about day to day, and then what about day of?
So personally, my principles behind eating is generally that you want to make sure you're fueled enough. So I focus on getting a lot of, not necessarily calories in, but just making sure that I eat enough. That's the fundamental of it. And then I track protein, sort of. I make sure I get around to I'm sorry, I'm converting in my head the pounds to, but anyways, 1 gram per pound.
Yeah.
Yeah, around there is what I'm shooting for. But aside from that, I don't track, the other macros so much, not at all, really, to be honest. So carbs or fats, it's just make sure that I feel energized to train, and then I focus on training and then the protein. Obviously, a lot of veggies is always good for you, so that's a big focus. But on top of that, it's mostly making sure I get enough into my system to be able to train as much as I want to, because generally I see a lot of better response from my body if I train harder than if I restrict fuel. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's
And what about after a competition? Let's say, for example, maybe, I mean, I know you're doing it different now, but let's say you did a qualifier on a Friday and you were going to have maybe two events that you were going to have to do on a Saturday, a semi and a final, or what have you.
hmm.
Would you eat something different on that day or in between the climbs?
Yeah. So the caveat, I guess, would be for competitions. Because I do kind of stray a little bit away from that during competitions. I make sure I do eat more liquid food to some extent before competitions. Just got to make sure that the belly doesn't get crazy from it or anything, but just like more liquids, generally speaking, will make me feel lighter for that day. Um, as long as I have just enough to stay energized. But yeah,
Do you mean like smoothies or goops or like what are you?
smoothies are quite common. I might do like yogurt and granola instead of an egg sandwich or something like that, which I usually do in the morning. So I'll change some things out for competitions for sure.
Do you, you said earlier in the conversation, like, oh, you just show up, you have a cup of coffee. Does caffeine make you nutty or it's okay?
I love caffeine. I run on it probably a little bit too much, to be honest. But no, it's it's a big part of my diet. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you, I'm wondering, like, for example, if you're working on a project, on solving problems,
Hmm.
have you ever in your, like in your sleep, in your dreams, have sort of some of the idea of how to approach it come to you?
I've had a lot of heartbreaking moments where I wake up and I have dreamt that I've climbed the thing I wanted to climb, my
Oh.
projects. Has happened on, I don't know how many occasions, numerous occasions to say the least. It happens regularly if I'm obsessing enough about a project. That is what we call them, by the way. The different climbs that we have as goals, we call projects. So yeah, definitely not uncommon.
Yeah, and I don't think people realize like the level of tenacity and endurance. So I was listening to about your Big Island project,
Hmm.
and where maybe as an athlete or climber, you go into a situation and you think, oh, I'll investigate a few times and I should be able to get it, and then you hear people, 4 years later, 5 years later, 6 years later. Do you think if you knew on some of these projects like how long it would take you, it would almost deter you from beginning? Like, because I would imagine once you get deep into it, you're like, well, the only way out is through, so I'm going to just deal with it. But what's that like?
Yeah, it's it's funny we get into project in climbing because it is a massive topic within climbing as well. That's usually very unrelatable to people because it's where we go the most crazy, I would say, where we do the weirdest things. So the Big Island, like you mentioned, is the name of a rock climb that I started projecting in 2018, end of 2018, early 2019, and I still haven't finished it. At the time, it was way above my level. And over the years, I've seen myself become closer and closer and closer. And now, when I was there in March, I could see the finishing line. I could really, really, really see that this could go any day now.
Now,
And
wait, before you go. So for a
mm,
climber, they understand what you mean. For a non-climber, how does one? I mean, you're a high level climber. How does one? Is it access to looking at the lines? Like, what does that mean above your level?
okay, so when we break down a climb, we break it down into different movements. So this one has a couple of easy movements and a couple of very hard movements. And the easy movements I could do at that time, but the harder ones were impossible. I couldn't even establish on the rock. So basically, that means that I'm obviously not going to make it from the start to the finish of the climb. And these boulder problems, as this one has a starting point and a finishing point when you get to the top of the rock. And making sure you go from the start and end up at the top, that's the goal of the climb. And at the time, there was just no possible theoretical way where I would be able to start at the bottom and make it to the top, because there were too many parts of that link that were missing. And over the years, I've practiced those parts. I've trained the different muscles here in Stockholm that are necessary for it. So, for instance, that one, you're kind of hugging the rock like a fridge. So I practiced flexibility in my legs to be able to squeeze with them against the rock, but also my upper body strength to be able to compress the rock to keep my body, attached to the wall. And that's the projecting process, so to speak. And over the years, each one of these movements have started to feel a lot easier, to the point where I feel like I can make all of them in one go, from the bottom to the top. So that's the projecting process.
And within it, is there like a switching gears? You said, earlier, oh, sometimes I have to relax, sometimes I have to go for it. You're talking about switching out these moves. And I'm wondering, like, one is probably a patience and a strength and a stillness. And then the other is to be explosive.
Hmm.
I think that that's so fascinating that within a really short distance over a period of time, you have to switch gears in that
Yeah,
way.
for sure. And a big part of that is learning how much you can, how simple you can make each of these movements. You have to make it so that you trust in your body to complete every single one easily, because putting them all together, that's the real challenge. And that comes with a lot of struggles, because some of these, as mentioned, will be easier, and those you have to make into something that's just abysmal. Like it has to feel like nothing. And then the more difficult ones, well, there you have to put on the pace and you have to mentally activate and think, okay, I'm gonna squeeze squeeze this rock as hard as I can. And it is a lot in pacing, and we do train a lot of pacing because of that, because we need to understand when to activate 200% more in a split second, essentially. And we get to practice it, but if we don't if we don't practice it, we either overdo it and try too hard on one move and then can't do the next, or we don't do it enough and can't complete the climb because we couldn't do the movements at all.
I can't help but think it must be really interesting when you're in the moment of, well, first off, oh, I can't do it, when you have to call it, even if you've gone for a while or for a distance. And then conversely, the feeling of the next time or the times after when I couldn't do that and I'm past that point.
Mm.
Besides the nature and sort of the sense of accomplishment, what is it that you feel? What is it that you feel when you from rock climbing, from taking on things like how you're going to feel when you're done with this big island challenge? Like, what is it that you get?
I guess it's, as in most things, it's a sense of accomplishment. I know it's completely arbitrary, and it can look pretty strange to be so obsessed about the small piece of rock for so many years. But it is a sport, and as in most sports, we're trying to become better at them. We're trying to learn from them. We're trying to hopefully apply some of it to our own lives, like we talked about a bit earlier. And the culmination of all that is the send, is what it's called, when you actually complete the climb. It gives a very high level of accomplishment, of satisfaction from having completed what you set out to do, and figuring out what that means, what you need to learn from it, what you need to progress with for it. And you can apply it to essentially anything in life, be it studies. I applied it to a lot of my engineering studies when I did that. I was programming a lot, so writing code and having to figure out the problems there has a similar sense of accomplishment. It's not quite the same as rock climbing for me, but I definitely apply a lot of the same principles behind it to that type of work.
I think for me, what stands out because is how you guys, it's piece by piece and then linking the whole story together. It is so true to how we have to navigate life, and you probably have a distinct advantage. Do you get coaching? Do you go to somebody and say, hey, maybe somebody who's really good at one move? Do you go to them and say, can you help me out? Like, how does that work? Getting new input and new tools.
So for specific projects like the Big Island, we usually talk, almost all the people working on that type of climb, the people at that level, discuss it with each other. Oh, how do you solve this? What are your tactics? How do you train? Like, what do you do? In general, when I was competing for the national team of Sweden, well, then we had a coach on the team that I would discuss training with and approach my approach to the various competitions. I haven't worked so much with a personal coach because, ironically, or not ironically, but the funny thing is just that everybody you climb with becomes sort of a tiny coach for every climbing session. We teach each other all the time, essentially, where we try and learn from each other, I should say.
Do you like kind of the solitude component? Does it get lonely, or is that part of the sort of appeal to it?
It is a big part of the appeal for me, actually. I very much enjoy just being having my own process and trying to figure out what it means for me, and why I'm actually on the climb, and why I appreciate it, why I don't, what I do appreciate about it. So I definitely get a lot of satisfaction from just working on things for myself, with myself. Would be my answer to it.
I wonder on a difficult project once it's completed, because I think also maybe something you guys deal with is your brain, like your nervous system must also be almost tapped out because you're sort of controlling all of this yourself all the time in this
Mm.
kind of still way. Is there a decompressing? Is there a kind of a valve release? Is there a practice of any of that you have to go through, especially after something that might be especially taxing, more mentally and emotionally
Mm.
than just the physical aspect?
Well, I definitely have worked a lot with the mental game of the sport. I am a
Mm-hmm.
very emotional climber. If you ever see any of my clips when I complete stuff, I go crazy. I run on top of the rock and scream of joy. And that's of course a great thing. But because I do that, there's also the contrary side of it where I am pressured to some extent, or at least I'm putting some sort of pressure on me that might be helping me perform at times, but also might be doing the complete opposite in other times. And I work a lot with how to manage that because I think it is one of my bigger strengths as a climber is being quite emotional and being very, actually caring about the climb and caring about what I'm doing. But it is also for sure uh, something that holds me back at times. And managing my way around that has taken more than a decade, and I wouldn't say that I'm finished with it yet. But there's a lot of mental practice to be done within the sport for sure.
I've seen with a lot of athletes that do the types of sports you do, or I learned it actually from my husband Laird. Is okay. I'm waiting to do this thing. It's so important. I'm frustrated when I can't do it. Okay, I did it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the conditions worked out, everything worked out. It was great, and that was good for about 36 hours, and then there's a come down.
Mm-hmm.
Because the amount of energy it takes, contained energy. And I think it's a really important lesson for people is it is almost like a little bit of a PTSD after, like I don't want to say a darkness, but I'd be like, okay, so let me get this straight. You got to do the thing. It was great. And now you're crashing because of what it took to do it.
Mm.
And I think that's really real. And when people can become kind of self-aware and just give themselves the space to deal with that because of the output needed.
Yeah, I usually do a lot of kind of soul searching after I do a climb. I definitely do. I try and deload. I try to just soak it in and make it into something that happens over time instead of just that explosion that happens right after. It continues to happen that I get extremely psyched right after, but I do try and partition it over time so that I can access that energy and embrace what happened. For a few weeks, sometimes even years. I have my first really big project. I guess I almost meditate on it at times of just the process that it took to climb that thing. Because I was out in -4 Fahrenheit, climbing in the dead of winter, just trying every single day, all year round, essentially. And it was like probably the biggest project that I'd ever had in climbing, and it was a very very special process that I can't just leave it at, oh, I'm done. Now I move forward. I still want it to be a part of me and what I did, and uh, and just not have it be finished, I guess.
Well, it is a gift. I think, that part of you that has to grow to navigate that, you do take that with you in your life. And I think that's really beautiful. Is there a project? I know you have the Big Island, but is there one sort of at the moment that's the kind of the dream that you're thinking about that will still agree with the algorithm?
Oh, well, to be fully frank, probably not. I will still make some stories about what I'm psyched on. So the Big
Mm.
Island, for instance, I'll definitely make some videos on. But there's probably nothing that I can document and know that, oh, this is going to be you popular on YouTube and kind of something I want to spend time creating a big video from. But I don't really mind either because it's kind of like we talked about. It is my process. the projecting, and it has to be an intrinsic experience. It has to be something that you're doing for yourself, because otherwise I think you end up not really enjoying it anymore, because you just take that external pressure and yeah, use that as fuel, which can maybe make you complete some stuff, but in the end, that's, I don't think, the way to reach longevity in a sport or in a field of any kind, be it work or studies or, well, sports.
Yeah. Can a person climb? I mean, if they're excited about it and not injured till deep into their life?
There are a lot of examples of people, well, deep into their lives climbing, for sure. They, especially within lead climbing, where it's more aerobic, you can do it for probably as long as you can move your body, essentially. Especially if you start, I don't think there is an actual starting age for it. I think as long as you make sure you train your whole body for your entire life, or like as long as possible, then you're going to be good to keep on going with it. Climbing definitely has, as with all sports, some sort of risky element. It is aggressive on the body, for sure. And if you fall incorrectly, like if you don't know how to fall or stuff like that, then you can for sure sustain an injury. But as long as you're doing everything correctly, then I wouldn't say that there's like a limit, so to speak, for how long you can do it.
Do you do anything? Because I think about how hard it is on your hands. Do you have anything that you do to just bring extra, like when you're done, soak your hands, stretch your hands? Like, are there things that you guys do? Because, I mean, it is, besides, never mind the wear and tear on the skin and scrapes and all the stuff. Is there anything that you do to help your hands?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, the different lotions I talked about is more for the skin, but
Right.
what I actually, one of my other bigger videos is from a protocol I did on a hangboard, where I would do it 2 times per day. So I would be on that hangboard 2 times per day, which of course sounds pretty bizarre if you heard me talk about it earlier in this podcast. But basically, that was from a very low intensity hang. So I would load around 40% of what I could maximally load, which is almost nothing. If we think about it in terms of, I don't know, a bench press, 40% of your max bench press isn't really that much. You can probably do it any time of the day if you'd like to. And that had the effect on me that my fingers became kind of, I wouldn't say bulletproof, but they became very resilient and, well, not especially prone to injury. So that's something that I do to help my fingers stay more healthy. There are other methods. I know some people use different oils. I think maybe CBD oils and those kind of things for their fingers. I haven't personally tested that, but I'm sure it could help. But for sure, there are a lot of different things to be done to help preserve those precious joints.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's, listen, the load that you guys put on it. Well, Emil, I want to let you get to bed since I know it is late there. I do want to just finish up with 2 questions. One is, how many hours do you work? Because I think this is important. You have taken what you do and you spend a lot of time and have expertise in it, but also the way you approach your YouTube channel and doing your videos, you also approach as a serious job. I mean, people, it's not like you just fling them up there. You spend hours on this.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, how many hours do you think you dedicate per week to this?
So it depends a little bit. I would say I spend around between 30 and 40 hours in front of the computer editing a week. And then I
Yeah.
spend around 3 hours a day training. And then I spend around, let's say, between 5 and 10 hours on admin stuff. So if it's sending out invoices or, anything else you might have to do that surrounds having a business. So definitely I do stay quite active. I work basically every day of the week, I would say. I try and take time off as often as as it seems to make sense for me. Like when I feel like, oh, no, I definitely should, and I have a good day for it. If it's sunny outside and I want to go kayaking, I'll go kayaking and try to make sure I get those days in as well. But it is a massive passion of mine, and it is my livelihood, and they all work very, very nicely together. And I love what I do. I love every single day, so I try and embrace it for that, because I feel incredibly privileged to be able to do what I do, to be able to make a living off of my passion, and also be able to share it with the rest of the world. I mean, I'm extremely lucky. So I don't want to waste it. I don't want to spend less time on it than I can. Kind of try to spend everything I have. Yeah.
Well, I think it really shows, and obviously your success is a reflection of that. But I just thought it was important to remind people, because sometimes I think people sit and they go, "Oh, well, look, I mean, that guy gets to climb for a living and he shoots videos, and if I could," it's like, it's also understanding everything takes work, and and maybe in certain ways you're working harder because it is the thing you love, but that there's sort of no getting away from the dedication and discipline it takes to do anything. And I really appreciate that, because consistency and the quality and everything, it really shows. It shows. So,
well, thank you. Appreciate
well,
that.
yeah. So in wrapping this up, if I have someone listening who they have now a indoor climbing facility, just from your point of view, what would be some of the kind of more important things for a beginner to think about, if they said, "Hey, you know what? I really want to give it a go. Like, I'm going to spend 6 months going, a couple times a week to the indoor gym." What are some things that you would just drop off to them to think about?
So I think a huge part of rock climbing, especially for beginners, is finding a community and sort of a goal with it. It doesn't have to be a specific, I have to achieve this with it, but just like, why, what do you get out of it? And for a lot of people, that will be finding new friends, or just talking to other people about climbing and nerding in on it. So I think that can be something that gives people a lot of like intrinsic power for climbing. Just having people they meet at the gym 2 times a week that are climbing the same climbs as they are, and they talk about them for 5 minutes, can give a lot of psych and energy towards the next session. So that's just a basic guide. Like, try and find people to climb with. It will be a ton of fun for almost anyone. But other than that, I would say listening to your body is always a key component to climbing. Partly on the wall of just, how do I move? How do I explore the climb as much as possible, the movement on the wall. But then also for yourself, to make sure you're rested and stuff like that when you go in and do it, so you don't get pains everywhere. So you always make sure you get the full value of the session. So you always come in fresh, psyched, and ready with a mind.
And like basic apparel, is it, like, because a lot of people don't realize, like, oh, you'd never wear a shirt with those sleeves because that's going to create a problem for whatever. What would be a great basic uniform for someone to go in to just kind of, be as efficient and functional as possible?
Well, climbing has a lot of different apparels. You'll see some people in flannel shirts rocking up at the gym, but in general, I would say sports clothes of some sort will feel the best on the wall, for me anyways, and that's usually what I'll wear, some sort of sports function clothing for sure. What
are your favorite shoes? Brand, what that makes the shoe that you like to wear when you climb?
So I am sponsored by them, but I also love them. They're called Mad Rock. It's a shoe brand that makes some very, very fantastic products, and they're also like the most affordable and durable. So for sure, something beginners should check out. If I can plug it, then I will. But I really do love their products for sure.
Great. Well, Emil, just remind people all the places they can find you.
All right, so you can find me primarily on YouTube. That's where I'll be spending most of my hours. But then also on Instagram at Emil_Abrahamsson_. And those are the two platforms that I'm the most active on. I have not yet gotten on TikTok or anything like that.
What are you doing? Come on.
Yeah, I do struggle with that platform, so I stick mostly to YouTube.
Well, I really appreciate your time and thank you for sharing kind of the, there is an artistic element. Athletes like you are as much artist and, kind of problem solver as you are physical athlete. And that's I always find such an interesting combination in sports,
It's very kind of you to say. It's a beautiful way of phrasing it as well. I appreciate that.
Well, it's true. Well, thanks for joining me, and everyone, thanks for listening.
Thank you.
So thanks again for joining me and listening to the Gabby Reece Show. Make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss a conversation. And if anything showed up today that you find would be helpful to someone you know, pass it along and make sure to share with us what really resonated and stood out for you in this conversation. Thanks again for joining us. Keep going, and I'll see you next time.